A poor mother takes her daughter to buy a dress for the school party with only $20. But a young billionaire sees everything and does something unexpected. The smell of burnt coffee and fried food still clung to her skin when Anne finally hung her apron behind the door of the tiny locker room at the family plate diner. Her hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, although her feet ached after 8 hours of running between sticky tables and impatient customers, but from the anxiety that had been with her since she woke up that morning. It was Friday, the 15th, and that meant the month's bills were piling up like storm clouds. The rent was due next week. The electricity bill had arrived with a figure that made her swallow hard. And Ember needed new shoes. Her current ones already showed her toes through the holes at the tip. At 25, Anne had become an expert in the mathematics of survival, adding what came in, subtracting what went out, and hoping the result never hit negative. But it was Friday, and that also meant her daughter was waiting for her at school with that smile that had the magical power to erase all the worries weighing on her shoulders. Anne glanced quickly at herself in the cracked locker room mirror. Her brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her tired face. She pinched her cheeks to add some color to her pale skin and straightened the simple blouse she had washed the night before. The October afternoon painted the streets of Chicago with a golden light. Anne walked through the familiar streets of the Brighton Park neighborhood, a name that always made her smile ironically, since hope was exactly what she tried to keep alive every day. She passed by Mr. Henderson's bakery, who waved from the window, by Mrs. Rodriguez's pharmacy, who always asked about Ember, by Mr. Miguel's newsstand, who saved the comic books for her daughter to flip through. It was a simple but welcoming neighborhood, the kind of place where people knew each other by name. Roosevelt Elementary School appeared at the end of the street, an old but well-maintained building with walls painted a light yellow. Anne could hear the cheerful buzz of children's voices mixed with the shouts of street vendors. Ember was waiting at the gate, her small pink fabric backpack hanging on her shoulders, her light brown hair tied in 2 braids that Anne had carefully made that morning. At 5 years old, Ember had the most expressive eyes Anne had ever seen. Large, honey-colored, capable of conveying pure joy or a melancholy too deep for her age. "Mommy!" Ember ran towards her as if she hadn't seen her in weeks. Anne felt that familiar tightness in her chest, a mixture of intense love and responsibility that had been with her since the day she first held her daughter in the hospital. It was a love that sometimes scared her with its intensity, a love that made her want to move mountains. "Hi, my love. How was school today? Miss Sarah said we're having a party next week." Ember's eyes shone with contagious excitement. "Each kid can bring their mommy or daddy, and we're going to dance and eat cake." Anne smiled, but she felt a knot form in her stomach. School parties always meant expectations, other children with new clothes bought especially for the occasion, well-dressed parents taking pictures with expensive cameras. She wanted Ember to feel special, not to notice the differences that seemed so glaring to Anne. "That's great, sweetie. Of course, Mommy will be there. Are you going to take time off from work? I'll talk to my boss. I'm sure he'll understand." In reality, Anne knew she would have to swap shifts with a colleague or simply miss a day, losing the day's pay. But seeing Ember's smile was worth any financial sacrifice. Ember took her hand, small, warm, trusting, and they began to walk down the neighborhood's main street. It was a walk they took every day, a sacred ritual that marked the transition between the world of work and the world of family. 15 minutes from the school to the small apartment they shared on the second floor of an old but well-kept building. Anne knew every crack in the sidewalk, every shop window, every sound that made up the urban symphony of the late afternoon. They passed the hardware store, the butcher shop where the butcher always saved the best cuts for his old customers, the corner grocery where Anne would run a tab when money was tight. It was a safe, known, predictable route, exactly what Anne needed in a life that had already faced too many surprises. Her husband's sudden death in a motorcycle accident when Ember was just a few months old had taught Anne that stability, however modest, was a treasure not to be underestimated. It was when they passed in front of the Dreams and Silks boutique that Anne's world was turned upside down. The shop was small but elegant, squeezed between a lottery kiosk and a cell phone store, with a carefully arranged window display that showed off dresses that looked like they had come from the pages of a fashion magazine. Anne rarely looked for more than a few seconds. It made no sense to desire things that were so far from her reality, but on that day, Ember stopped abruptly, as if struck by lightning. "That dress is beautiful, Mommy!" The girl's voice exploded in pure exclamation, her wide eyes fixed on the window. Anne followed her daughter's gaze and felt the air leave her lungs. In the center of the window, illuminated by a soft light that made it seem almost magical, was a dress that looked like it had been created specifically for a 5-year-old girl's dream. It was a delicate, almost celestial, light blue, with small, hand-embroidered flowers all over the full skirt. The fabric seemed to float, even while static behind the glass, and it had an ethereal quality that transformed a simple piece of clothing into something close to a fairy tale. Ember pressed her face against the cold glass of the window, her breath creating small clouds of vapor. "Mommy, look how pretty it is. It looks like something a princess would wear." Anne's stomach clenched as her eyes found the small discreet tag in the bottom right corner of the dress. The price made her swallow hard. It was equivalent to almost 3 weeks of her salary as a waitress, 3 weeks of paid bills and of food on the table, of small luxuries like ice cream on Sunday. "Mommy, can I wear this dress to the school party? Please?" The question was loaded with all the innocence and hope that only a 5-year-old could have. Ember didn't understand tight budgets, bills that arrived at the end of the month like relentless creditors, or the difficult choices Anne made every day between need and want. To her, pretty dresses existed to be worn by little girls at important parties. Anne knelt beside her daughter, feeling the cold concrete of the sidewalk through the fabric of her jeans. She wished she could say yes. She wished she could walk into that store and buy not just that dress, but a dozen of them. She wanted to see Ember's face light up with the pure joy of a child whose dreams come true. She wanted to be the kind of mother who could provide her daughter with magic without having to calculate the cost of every little miracle. Instead, she lowered her gaze, fixing her eyes on her own worn-out shoes, a pair of black flats she had bought on sale 2 years ago. "I'm sorry, sweetie, I only have 20. Anne began, her voice coming out softer than she intended, heavy with a pain she tried to hide. "We don't have that kind of money." The words came out like shards of glass, cutting the air between them. Anne hated having to be the one to shatter dreams, to place limits on the infinite world of possibilities that should exist in the mind of a 5-year-old. Ember didn't insist. She didn't throw a tantrum. She didn't cry. She didn't ask why other children could have pretty dresses and she couldn't. At 5D2, she had already learned to recognize the tone in her mother's voice that meant some things were simply not possible, no matter how much you wished for them. Instead, she simply stepped away from the glass and held Anne's hand tighter, as if to comfort her mother for the pain she knew she was causing. The simple gesture was like a stab to Anne's heart. Her daughter's silent understanding, the way Ember accepted the refusal without protest, the premature maturity that circumstances had forced upon a child who should only be worried about playing. They stood there for a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity. The afternoon sun painted long shadows on the sidewalk, and Anne felt that familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the responsibility of being both a mother and a father, the guilt of not being able to give her daughter everything she deserved. It was then that a male voice, gentle but hesitant, cut through the heavy silence that had formed between mother and daughter. "That dress is beautiful." Anne looked up, surprised. A man was standing a few feet away, having clearly witnessed the entire intimate scene that had unfolded at the shop window. He was tall, about 6 feet, and well-dressed in a way that didn't scream wealth, but whispered quality and understated elegance. His hair was dark, the color of dark chocolate, slightly tousled by the October wind, and he had eyes that seemed to carry an unusual depth, dark, honey-colored, almost golden when the light hit them. There was something about his posture, confident but not arrogant, present but respectful. The man took a few steps closer, maintaining a respectful distance. His clothes were simple but clearly expensive, a white cotton dress shirt that looked custom-tailored, dress pants that fell perfectly over brown leather shoes that reflected care and quality. It was more than the clothes. It was the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his gestures, the way his eyes seemed to truly see people. There was a presence about him that suggested someone accustomed to being in charge, but without arrogance. "Can I buy it for you?" He directed the question to Ember, but his eyes sought Anne's, silently asking for permission. Anne felt the world stop for a moment. Strangers didn't offer expensive gifts to children on the street. Well-dressed men didn't approach single mothers with proposals that seemed too good to be true. Every protective instinct she had developed screamed caution, but there was something in the man's eyes, a sincerity she recognized, a kindness that didn't seem rehearsed. He had witnessed an intimate moment of pain between a mother and daughter, and offered help without seemingly expecting anything in return. Anne hesitated, her mind racing between gratitude, wounded pride, and suspicion. Ember, however, didn't have the same reservations. She looked at the man with the natural curiosity that only children possess, without the filters and fears that adults develop. "Do you know my mommy?" she asked, tilting her head to the side like a curious little bird. "I haven't had the pleasure yet," he replied, a genuine smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Shy, but I can see that you two are very special." Anne felt something stir in her chest, a mix of surprise, gratitude, and something she couldn't name. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her and Ember, as if they were truly worthy of attention and care. "Please," the man continued, addressing Anne with respectful formality. "I know this might seem strange, a stranger offering this, but—" he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "There's something about this moment that touched me deeply, and I would very much like to be able to do this for you." Anne looked at Ember, who was watching the conversation intently, then back at the man. There were risks, of course, but there was also an opportunity, not just to get the dress, but perhaps to show Ember that the world could be kind. "Okay," she said finally, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "But why?" The man smiled, and Anne noticed small lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who knew how to truly smile, who had lived enough to understand the value of small gestures of kindness. "Because some things in life are too important not to happen," he replied simply. Ember, who had listened to the entire conversation with the seriousness of a little adult, suddenly lit up with an idea that sparkled in her eyes like fireworks. "Do you want to come to my party?" The question came out with all the spontaneity and joy that Anne had tried to protect throughout the conversation. The man seemed genuinely surprised for the first time since he had approached. He looked at Anne, then at Ember, and something in his expression changed, as if a door that had been locked for a long time had opened just a crack, letting in a ray of light. "I think I'd love that," he said, and his voice carried a sincerity that made Anne believe he really meant it. As the three of them headed towards the entrance of the boutique, Anne still a bit hesitant but curious, Ember beaming with joy, and the strange man who had appeared like a character from a fairy tale on an ordinary Friday afternoon, Anne couldn't stop thinking that maybe some things in life really did happen for a reason. The blue dress with embroidered flowers waited patiently behind the glass, ready to transform not just a school party, but perhaps the entire trajectory of two lives that were about to intertwine with a third in ways none of them could imagine. And as the boutique saleswoman approached with a professional smile, Anne realized that sometimes miracles came disguised as kind strangers on Friday afternoons, when you least expected and most needed them. The hall at Roosevelt Elementary School had never looked so beautiful. Colorful balloons hung from the ceiling, like drops of joy suspended in the air, and crepe paper streamers transformed the ordinary space into something magical. The smell of chocolate cake mingled with the scent of flowers the teachers had placed on the tables, creating a festive atmosphere that made the children's eyes sparkle with pure happiness. Anne adjusted the blue floral dress on Ember for the third time in 5 minutes, her hands trembling slightly. She couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious man who had bought the dress just a week earlier. Would he really show up? The promise had been made by a stranger, and Anne knew all too well that promises from strangers rarely came true. Mommy, do you think he'll come? Ember asked, as if she had read her mother's thoughts. Her little honey-colored eyes scanned the entrance of the hall with anticipation. I don't know, sweetie. But even if he doesn't, we're going to have a lot of fun, okay? Anne tried to sound confident, but a part of her also hoped for the appearance of the man who had completely changed their week. Ember had talked about him every day, creating stories about how much fun it would be to show him the school, introduce him to her friends, and teach him the games she knew. The party had started 15 minutes ago, and the hall was already bustling with children running between tables, parents chatting in small groups, and teachers trying to organize the first activities. Anne watched it all with a mix of joy and discomfort. Joy to see Ember so beautiful and happy. Discomfort for being one of the few mothers there who clearly looked out of place. The other mothers wore clothes that cost more than Anne earned in a month. Their hair was perfectly styled, their nails manicured, their purses matched their shoes. Anne looked at her own hands, calloused from work, nails cut short for practicality, and felt small. It was then that she saw him. Rowan was standing at the entrance of the hall, wearing a light blue dress shirt that highlighted his golden eyes and casual trousers that managed to be both elegant and relaxed. He held a small wrapped gift in his hands, and his eyes scanned the room until they found Ember. He came! He came! Ember shouted, running towards Rowan with a speed that made Anne worry she might trip in her new dress. Rowan's face lit up when he saw Ember running towards him. He crouched down, opening his arms, and the little girl threw herself into them with all the trust in the world. Anne felt something tighten in her chest as she watched the way he hugged her, careful yet warm, as if she were made of precious porcelain. "You look beautiful, princess," he said, pulling back slightly to admire the dress. "Even more beautiful than I imagined." Ember twirled, making the full skirt of the dress fly around her legs. "Do you like it?" "Mommy said you bought it for me." "I like it very much. You look like a real princess." Anne approached, still a bit hesitant. There was something surreal about seeing this man here, fulfilling a promise made to a 5-year-old child. In Anne's life experience, adults made promises to children and then found excuses not to keep them. "Are you really came?" she said, an involuntary note of surprise in her voice. "Of course I came. A promise is a promise, especially when it's made to someone so special," Rowan replied, giving Anne a gentle smile before turning his attention back to Ember. "And I brought you a little something." He handed the gift to Ember, who opened it with the exaggerated care children have for important presents. Inside was a set of special colored pencils and a drawing pad with a cover decorated with flowers, just like the ones on her dress. "For a talented artist," Rowan explained. Ember's eyes sparkled like stars. "Do you want to draw with me?" "I would love to." What happened next completely surprised Anne. In a matter of minutes, Rowan was sitting on the floor next to Ember, completely oblivious to the fact that his expensive clothes might get dirty, drawing with the concentration of a child. He asked about every color she chose, praised every stroke, and laughed genuinely at the stories she told about her drawings. Anne sat in a nearby chair, watching the interaction with a mix of fascination and caution. There was something about the way Rowan interacted with Ember that touched her deeply. He wasn't just being polite or fulfilling a social obligation. He seemed genuinely interested, present in a way that few adults could be with children. "Now I'm going to draw you," Ember announced, picking up a pink pencil. "Do you know how to draw people?" "I do. Miss Sarah taught me." "But you have to stay very still." Rowan struck an exaggeratedly serious pose, remaining motionless as a statue, which made Ember laugh so hard she could barely hold the pencil. Anne found herself smiling involuntarily at the ease with which the two connected. "Done," Ember announced after a few minutes, showing him the drawing. It was a typical child's drawing, simple lines, strange proportions, but made with all the love in the world. It showed Rowan, herself, and Anne all holding hands with a big yellow sun shining above them. "It's perfect," Rowan said, and Anne could see he truly thought so. "Can I keep it?" "You can. But only if you promise to put it on the fridge." "I promise I'll put it in the most special place in my house." As the afternoon went on, Anne watched Rowan help Ember with the games, teach her simple magic tricks he had learned as a child, and listened patiently to every story she had to tell. He seemed to have infinite patience and a natural ability to talk to children without sounding condescending. During a moment when Ember was playing with other children, Rowan approached Anne. "She's incredible," he said, watching Ember lead a group of children in a circle game. "You've done a wonderful job with her." Anne felt her face flush. "It's not always easy." "Especially," she hesitated, then decided to be honest, "especially being alone and with a job that barely pays the bills. What do you do?" The question came with genuine curiosity, without any tone of judgment. Anne took a deep breath. This was the moment he would find out she wasn't a middle-class mom with an organized life, but a waitress struggling to get by. "I work as a waitress at the Family Plate Diner downtown." Rowan nodded, his expression remaining exactly the same. Interested, respectful. "That must be a tough job." "It is. 8 hours on my feet, dealing with all kinds of customers. But it's honest, and it allows me to take care of Ember." Anne braced herself for the subtle shift that always happened when people found out her profession, the slightly distant look, the more superficial conversation, the forced politeness that replaced genuine interest. But none of that happened. "I imagine you're very good at what you do," Rowan said. "And you have this way of making people feel important, cared for. I'm sure your customers notice that." The response caught Anne completely off guard. No one had ever spoken about her job that way. No one had ever suggested that being a waitress required skills, that it was more than just carrying plates. Thank you." "Not everyone sees it that way." "Then they're not really looking," Rowan replied simply. "Honest work deserves respect, no matter what it is." Anne felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the feeling of being seen, of being valued, of having her struggles acknowledged without pity or condescension. "Mommy! Rowan! Come dance!" Ember shouted from the other side of the hall where the children had formed a circle. "I think we've been summoned," Rowan said, extending his hand to Anne. "I'm not a very good dancer," she protested. "Neither am I. But I have a feeling that won't matter to her." As the three of them joined the circle of children, dancing to a simple song and laughing at their clumsy attempts to follow the steps, Anne realized something had changed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel judged. She didn't feel small. She didn't feel like she had to apologize for who she was or what she did. And when she saw Ember hold Rowan's hand with total confidence, spinning under his arms while laughing with pure joy, Anne allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, some people really did appear in our lives exactly when we needed them most. It was an ordinary Tuesday at the Family Plate Diner when Anne saw a familiar figure appear at the entrance. The lunch rush was at its peak, with the constant noise of clattering dishes, overlapping conversations, and the scraping of chairs against the worn ceramic floor. Anne balanced 3 plates on one arm while carrying a pitcher of orange juice in the other hand, navigating the tight spaces between tables with the skill of someone who had perfected that dance for years. The diner was bustling with its usual clientele, office workers from nearby buildings on their lunch break, retirees who came more for the company than the food, and mothers with young children who knew they would find generous portions and fair prices there. It was the kind of place that survived not on sophistication, but on authenticity and the care with which the food was prepared. When her eyes met Rowan standing at the entrance, Anne almost dropped the pitcher. He was there, wearing a navy blue dress shirt and casual tailored pants, looking around the diner with genuine curiosity. He didn't look out of place exactly, but there was something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the quiet but undeniable quality of his clothes, the calm confidence in his gestures that set him apart from the other customers. Anne finished serving the table she was at, trying to control the sudden nervousness that overcame her, and approached him with a racing heart. A part of her was genuinely happy to see him. Another part felt exposed, as if he were seeing a side of her she preferred to keep private. "Rowan, what are you doing here?" "I thought I'd see where you work," he replied with a smile that seemed genuinely interested rather than merely curious. "I hope you don't mind. I was in the area and..." Well, I admit I was curious to see you in action. No, I don't mind, Anne interrupted quickly, realizing she truly didn't. In fact, there was something touching about the fact that he had gone to the trouble of finding her, of wanting to know more about her life. It's just that, well, this place isn't exactly... It's welcoming, Rowan completed, looking around again with genuine attention. It has real character. And it smells incredibly good. Anne followed his gaze, trying to see the place through his eyes. The diner was simple, almost modest, with formica tables that showed signs of wear, chairs that had seen better days but were still solid. The walls were decorated with old photos of the neighborhood, black and white images that told the story of the area, and plants that the owner, Maria, insisted on keeping. It wasn't sophisticated, but it had its own charm, an authenticity that many expensive restaurants tried to imitate. "Would you like a table?" Anne asked, nervously adjusting her apron. "Actually, I was hoping to find out when you take your break, if it's not too much to ask, of course." Anne looked at the clock on the wall, an old model with large numbers that Maria insisted on keeping in working order. Her noon break was in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. "But are you sure you want to wait?" "I only have half an hour, and the place gets really crowded at this time." "I'm sure I don't mind the crowd," he smiled. "Actually, I want to see how you work." Rowan chose a table in the corner, strategically positioned where he could watch Anne work without getting in the way. He ordered a coffee and a pastry, simple choices that wouldn't require special attention from the kitchen, and Anne couldn't help but notice how he treated the other staff. There was the same respectful courtesy he showed her, without any air of superiority. For the next 15 minutes, Anne found herself hyper-aware of her movements. There was something strange and yet exciting about being watched in her work environment by someone who clearly came from a different world. She wondered what he was thinking, if he was judging the simplicity of the place, the constant rush, the way she had to maintain a professional smile, even when rude customers treated her as if she were invisible. But whenever she glanced discreetly in his direction, Rowan seemed genuinely interested, not judgmental. He watched with the attention of someone who truly wanted to understand her world. When she calmed down an angry customer complaining about the wait, she saw Rowan nod approvingly. When she helped a new colleague who was nervous about the rush, she noticed him smile. When her break finally came, Anne sat in the chair across from him, still wearing her diner apron. Her hands smelled of detergent and bleach. Her feet ached a little inside her practical shoes. But there was something deeply comforting about his presence, as if she could let her guard down. "So, what did you think?" she asked, half joking, half fearful of the answer. "I thought you're even better at what you do than I imagined," Rowan answered without hesitation, his voice carrying a sincerity that caught her off guard. "You have a natural way of making every customer feel important, even when you're clearly racing against the clock, and I saw how your colleagues interact with you. They trust you, ask for your help, respect your opinion. That says a lot about who you are." Anne felt her face flush, unaccustomed to having her work analyzed so positively. "It's just work. Nothing special." "I completely disagree. I saw you calm that angry customer without losing your composure, help the new waitress when she was clearly flustered, and still manage to keep everything organized and efficient. That's not just work. That requires real skill, extraordinary patience, and an emotional intelligence that many people don't have." Anne looked down at her own hands, calloused and with small cuts, not quite knowing how to respond to such direct compliments. In her experience, when people found out she was a waitress, they usually assumed things about her education, her ambitions, her abilities. Rowan was doing the exact opposite, seeing skills where others saw only service. "Is Ember at school?" he asked, delicately changing the subject. "She is. She gets out at 5. Anne paused, then added impulsively, "If you want, I mean if you don't have other important plans, you could come by the house later. I'm sure she would be thrilled to see you." The smile that spread across Rowan's face was genuine and warm, lighting up his golden eyes. "I'd love that." "I have nothing more important than that." They talked about simple things for the rest of her break, about the neighborhood and its history, about how Anne had found her job at the diner, about the things Ember was learning in school. It was an easy, pressure-free conversation, and Anne was surprised by how much she was enjoying his company. The way he truly listened to her answers. When she had to go back to work, Rowan stood up too, leaving a generous tip that made Anne protest. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation," he said, ignoring her protests about the tip. "And for letting me see you in your element. See you later." "Yes, see you." Anne watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. There was something about Rowan that intrigued her deeply, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her life, without condescension or pity, as if she were an interesting and valuable person in her own right, not a charity case. Later that afternoon, when Anne arrived home with Ember after picking her up from school, she found Rowan waiting patiently at the entrance to her building. He had a wrapped children's book in his hands and a smile that widened when he saw Ember run towards him. "Rowan, you came. You really came." Ember threw herself into his arms with the familiarity of a child who had found a new special friend. "Of course I came, Princess. I promised, didn't I?" As they climbed the stairs to the small apartment, Anne felt strangely nervous. Rowan had seen her at work, but now he would see where she lived. The modest apartment with well-cared-for second-hand furniture, the simple but cozy decor, Ember's toys neatly organized in the small living room. But if Rowan noticed the simplicity of the place, he not only showed no discomfort, but seemed genuinely at ease. Instead, he complimented the plants Anne cared for on the small balcony, sincerely admired Ember's drawings stuck to the refrigerator, and sat on the living room floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I brought you a present," he said to Ember, handing her the wrapped gift with solemnity. It was a book of fairy tales with beautiful illustrations and thick pages, the kind that would last for years, even with the enthusiastic handling of a child. Ember opened it with reverent care, running her fingers over the colorful pages. "Do you want me to read it to you?" Rowan asked. "Yes, but first I want to show you my homework. Ms. Sarah said I did a really good job today." What followed was one of the most surprising afternoons Anne had experienced in a long time. Rowan helped Ember with her math homework, explaining the problems with infinite patience and a teaching style that made the girl laugh, as she learned concepts that had previously confused her. He told elaborate stories about the book's characters, giving them different voices that made Ember double over with laughter. When Anne was preparing dinner in the small kitchen, she could hear the two of them laughing in the living room, and something in her chest warmed in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. There was something deeply comforting in hearing Ember so happy, so free to just be a carefree child. "Mommy!" Ember called from the living room, her voice full of excitement. "Come see what Rowan taught me." Anne joined them in the living room to find Ember performing simple magic tricks that Rowan had taught her. Nothing elaborate, just basic tricks with cards and coins that made a 5-year-old feel like a real professional magician. "Look," Ember made a coin disappear behind Anne's ear, and then found it again with a dramatic flourish. "I'm a real magician." "You're amazing," Anne said, hugging her daughter affectionately. "A very talented magician." As the evening went on, Anne found herself relaxing in a way she no longer knew was possible. There was something about Rowan's presence that made the small family feel complete, as if a piece she didn't even know was missing had been carefully placed in the right spot. When it was time for Ember to go to bed, she insisted that Rowan help with her entire nighttime routine. He brushed her teeth in the small bathroom, helped her put on her pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed while Anne read the usual bedtime story. "Rowan," Ember said after Anne finished the story and was tucking her in. "Yes, Princess." "Will you come back tomorrow?" The question came out with all the vulnerability of a child who had found something special and was genuinely afraid of losing it. Anne felt her heart ache, worried about what the answer might do to Ember's fragile feelings. Rowan looked at Anne, then back at Ember, considering his words carefully. "If your mommy lets me," he replied with complete sincerity, without empty promises. Anne felt something move deep within her chest. The way he had placed the decision in her hands, completely respecting her authority as a mother, while clearly wanting to come back. There was a consideration in that gesture that touched her more than she expected. "Kais, you can come back," she said softly, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised her. "If you want to, of course. I really want to." And so began a routine that Anne had never imagined could exist in her structured life. Rowan started showing up every day after work, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes he brought new, carefully chosen books, other times educational games or puzzles, always some small surprise that made Ember's eyes light up. He patiently helped with homework, turning difficult lessons into fun games, told elaborate stories that made Ember travel to distant worlds, taught increasingly impressive magic tricks, and gradually became a constant and deeply comforting presence in their lives. Ember blossomed under his dedicated attention. Her grades at school improved consistently, her confidence grew visibly, and she developed a curiosity about the world that Anne had never seen before. Rowan answered every question with infinite patience, no matter how absurd, and always found creative ways to turn lessons into memorable experiences. It was on a Thursday, almost 2 weeks after his first visit to the diner, that Ember gave Rowan a special drawing she had made with extra care. Anne was tidying up the kitchen when she heard Ember call out, "Rowan, I made something special for you." Anne craned her neck to get a better look. Ember was holding a carefully colored drawing, much more elaborate than her previous works. It showed the three of them together, holding hands, with Ember wearing the blue floral dress, and a big yellow sun shining above them. In the background, she had drawn a house with symmetrical windows and a red door, and flowers of all colors scattered across an imaginary garden. "I made it for you," Ember said, extending the paper to Rowan with the solemnity of someone offering a treasure. Anne saw Rowan's expression change completely. His eyes filled with tears, and he was silent for a moment, studying every detail of the drawing, as if it were the most precious work of art in the world. It's beautiful," he said finally, his voice a little hoarse with emotion. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received in my entire life. You really like it, for real. I like it more than I can explain with words." Rowan looked at the drawing for a few more moments, then raised his eyes to Anne and Ember. There was something different in his expression, a decision, a courage that wasn't there before. "Girls," he said, and his voice carried a warm seriousness. "Would you like to go on an outing with me on Sunday?" Anne hesitated for a moment. Outings meant unknown territory, meant breaking the safe routine they had established. It meant admitting that what was happening between them was more than just a casual friendship, but Ember immediately vibrated, bouncing on the spot. Yes, where are we going? Can we go to the park, or the mall, or the zoo?" "Ember," Anne interrupted gently, then looked at Rowan. There was something in his eyes that completely reassured her, a sincerity that made her believe he truly wanted to be there, that he wasn't just being polite. Anne smiled, feeling something open in her chest like a flower that had been closed for a long time. "Yes, let's go." Lincoln Park had never seemed as vibrant as it did on that Sunday morning. The sun filtered through the treetops, creating golden patterns on the lush green grass, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers blooming everywhere. Anne adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, watching Ember run a few steps ahead of them, her loose hair dancing in the wind. Rowan carried a picnic basket that he had carefully prepared. Inside were sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, fresh fruit, natural juices, and star-shaped cookies he had bought especially for Ember. It was the first time in years he had planned a family outing, and the mix of anxiety and anticipation had been with him since he woke up. "Look, Mommy, there are ducks." Ember pointed to the lagoon where a few birds were swimming peacefully. "How about we have our picnic over there by the water?" Rowan suggested, indicating a grassy area with enough shade and a view of the lagoon. Anne nodded, feeling a lightness and ease she hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something magical about that morning. Maybe it was the golden sun, maybe it was Ember's constant laughter, or maybe it was the way Rowan seemed genuinely happy to be there with them. They spread out the plaid blanket Rowan had brought and arranged the food with the care of someone creating a special memory. Ember sat between them, naturally forming a triangle that seemed to come from instinct. "I've never seen so many pretty sandwiches," Ember exclaimed, picking up a small triangle of whole wheat bread. "Did you make them all by yourself?" "I did. I wanted to do my best for two very special ladies," Rowan replied, and Anne felt her face flush slightly. As they ate, they talked about simple things. The birds flying overhead, the clouds forming shapes in the sky, Ember's plans for upcoming school activities. It was a conversation without rush, without an agenda, and Rowan was surprised by how much he was enjoying these seemingly ordinary moments. There was something deeply comforting about being there, sitting on the grass, sharing homemade food and laughter. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about meetings or responsibilities. His mind was completely present in that moment, with these two people who had become important in a way he was still trying to understand. "Can I feed the ducks?" Ember asked when she finished eating. "Of course, but let's go together," Anne replied, getting up. The three of them walked to the edge of the lagoon, where Ember had fun tossing small pieces of bread to the ducks that swam over. Rowan watched the interaction between mother and daughter, the way Anne gently guided Ember, explained the animals' behavior, and laughed at the girl's funny observations. "Rowan, look, that duck looks like it's dancing." Ember pointed to a duck shaking itself in the water. "It really does. Maybe it's happy about the snack," Rowan replied, kneeling beside her. After feeding the ducks, they rented a paddle boat. Rowan and Anne took turns pedaling while Ember sat in the middle, excitedly commenting on everything she saw: other families in the park, boats on the lake, trees reflected in the water. "Faster, faster," Ember laughed, and Rowan pushed harder on the pedals, making her giggle even more. Anne watched the two of them with a smile on her face. There was something natural in the way Rowan interacted with Ember, as if he always knew exactly what to say to make her happy. It wasn't forced, it was genuine, spontaneous. When they returned to the shore, Ember insisted on running on the grass. The three of them found themselves chasing butterflies, tossing a ball someone had left behind, and laughing at their own clumsy attempts to do cartwheels. Rowan found himself lying on the grass, looking up at the blue sky, with Ember counting clouds beside him and Anne packing up the picnic leftovers. In that moment, something settled in his chest, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years, as if this was where he was supposed to be, as if these were the people he was supposed to share his Sundays with. During a walk along the park's shaded paths, with Ember running a few feet ahead picking small flowers, Rowan felt brave enough to ask a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Anne," he said, hesitating for just a moment, "can I ask about Ember's father?" Anne didn't seem surprised by the question. In fact, there was a serenity in her expression that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. "He died in an accident shortly after she was born," she replied simply, her voice calm but carrying an old sadness she had learned to bear. "A motorcycle accident. She was only 3 months old." Rowan felt something tighten in his chest. The simplicity of her answer carried an enormous weight: years of grief, of raising a child alone, of being strong when she probably wanted to break down. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the words were filled with genuine sincerity. "Thank you. It was hard. But look at what we managed," Anne smiled, watching Ember, who had now stopped to observe a squirrel. "She's amazing, isn't she? She's extraordinary. You both are." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Rowan thought about how Anne had built a life, raised a fantastic daughter, and maintained her strength and joy despite everything she had faced. A deep admiration was growing in his chest, mixed with something more that he wasn't yet ready to name. "Mommy, Rowan!" Ember called, running back to them with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I made another drawing." She carefully unfolded the paper, revealing a new drawing made with the colored pencils she always carried in her small backpack. This time, it showed the three of them under a flowering tree, a large tree with pink blossoms falling like rain around them. The three of them were smiling, holding hands, and at the top of the page she had written in careful letters, "My happy family." Rowan felt something move deep inside him as he looked at the drawing. It wasn't just the colored lines on the paper, it was the way Ember saw them, how she had naturally included them in her idea of family. It was the moment the reality of what was happening became clear and inevitable. "It's beautiful, Ember," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. "Can I give this one to you too?" "I would love to have this drawing." As Ember ran off again towards a group of children playing nearby, Rowan looked at Anne and then at the drawing in his hands. In that moment, with the sun setting on the horizon and painting the sky in golden hues, he understood with a startling clarity he was truly involved. He was no longer just a well-intentioned man helping a single mother and her daughter. It was something real, deep, that had grown silently in his heart during all those afternoons of homework, bedtime stories, and drawings on the fridge. He was in love, not just with Anne, but with the life they had built, the family they were, the possibility of being part of something bigger than himself. And for the first time in many years, instead of being frightened by the intensity of this feeling, Rowan allowed himself to embrace it completely. The routine settled in so naturally that Anne barely noticed when Rowan stopped being a visitor and became part of the household's daily life. It happened gradually, like a sunrise. There was no specific moment when darkness turned to light, but suddenly it was there, warming everything around it. It was a Monday when Anne noticed she had automatically set 3 plates at the table without thinking. It was a Wednesday when she realized Ember spoke of him in the plural. "We are going to do as we like," as if the 3 of them were a natural unit. It was a Saturday when she realized she was saving the special coffee he liked, buying the cookies he had complimented, and organizing her daughter's schedule considering the times he would be over. Rowan arrived every day around 6 in the evening, after Anne got back from work and Ember from school. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes he brought ingredients for dinner, other times an educational toy for Ember. Always small things that showed he thought of them during the day. But more important than what he brought was what he offered. Genuine presence, complete attention, an emotional availability that Anne didn't know she was missing until she started to experience it. He didn't arrive as a guest who needed to be entertained. Instead, he simply integrated into whatever was happening. If Anne was cooking, he would ask if he could help, and upon receiving a positive answer, he would wash dishes or chop vegetables with the naturalness of someone who belonged in that space. If Ember was doing homework, he would sit beside her at the small kitchen table, offering help when needed, but letting her work alone when she was able. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that the kitchen sink faucet started to leak. Anne looked at the constant dripping with a heavy heart. Another thing to worry about, another expense she would have to fit into her tight budget. She was mentally calculating how much it would cost to call a plumber when Rowan arrived. "Guy, plumbing problem?" he asked, noticing her worried expression and the sound of the drip hitting the sink. "The faucet is leaking. It'll have to wait until I can save up enough to call someone," Anne sighed, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Can I take a look? I'm no expert, but I've dealt with this before." Anne hesitated for a moment. Accepting help was still difficult for her. Years of forced independence had created an instinctive resistance to depending on anyone. But there was something in the way Rowan offered that didn't feel like charity or condescension. It was simply what one person does when they see another with a problem they can help solve. "Okay," she said finally. There are tools in the utility closet." Rowan spent the next 40 minutes under the sink, with Ember sitting on the floor beside him, asking questions about every tool and every move he made. Anne watched them from the kitchen doorway, touched by the patience with which he answered each of the girls' curiosities, by the way he turned a simple repair into an informal lesson in basic mechanics. "There," he said finally, testing the faucet. "It just needed a new washer. Should last a good while now." "Thank you," Anne said, and the word came out loaded with more gratitude than she intended to show. "How much do I owe you for the part?" "Nothing. I had it left over from the last time I worked on my own faucet." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Rowan said it so naturally that Anne didn't feel diminished by the gesture. It was just what people who cared about each other did. Gradually, these small gestures became part of the routine. Rowan didn't announce his intentions or ask for permission. He just did them. He changed a burnt-out light bulb when he noticed it. He took the trash out to the street when he saw it was collection day. He assembled a toy that had arrived in pieces when Ember couldn't do it herself. "Rowan is our special friend," Ember said one afternoon, clutching a book he had given her. "He's not like other grown-ups, is he?" Anne was folding laundry in the living room, and her daughter's observation made her pause for a moment. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "He doesn't look at his phone when I talk to him, and he doesn't get impatient when it takes me a while to understand things, and he always wants to know what I'm really thinking, not just if I'm okay." The simplicity of the explanation touched Anne deeply. Ember had noticed something that many adults missed, the difference between physical presence and emotional presence. Rowan offered the latter, completely, every time he was with them. At first, Anne had felt a constant anxiety with his presence. Not because he did anything wrong, but because she wasn't used to having someone so present. For years, she and Ember had operated as a two-person unit, each taking care of the other, creating their own routines and rhythms. The idea that someone might want to be a part of that, without expecting anything specific in return, seemed too good to be true. But as the weeks went by, Anne realized that Rowan didn't want to change anything they had built. He just wanted to be there, to be part of it, to add his presence to the existing dynamic without disruption or demand. He didn't try to take on a fatherly role with Ember. He never contradicted a decision of Anne's or tried to discipline the girl. Instead, he naturally followed Anne's lead, supporting her decisions and reinforcing her rules. When Ember tested boundaries, as all children do, Rowan would look to Anne and wait for her guidance. He didn't try to reorganize the house or suggest improvements. He simply appreciated the space they had created. He complimented the way Anne had decorated with limited resources, the organization she had managed to create in the small space, the way every corner reflected the care and attention she put into making that house a home. He didn't try to solve all their problems or take on financial responsibilities. He offered help when he saw a specific need, but always in a way that preserved Anne's dignity and autonomy. Rowan didn't force anything. He was just there, and that was enough. Anne was surprised by how much this constant yet unpretentious presence was affecting her life. It had been years since she had completely relaxed when she came home from work. There was always something to do, some worry to address, some responsibility weighing on her shoulders. But now, when she opened the door and saw Rowan and Ember at the kitchen table, doing homework or putting together a puzzle, she felt her shoulders relax automatically. It wasn't that he took over her responsibilities. It was that she didn't have to carry them alone. There was someone there who genuinely cared about her and Ember's well-being, someone who wanted things to work out for them, someone who was willing to help without expecting recognition or reward. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Anne realized how much things had changed. She came home from work with a headache and aching feet, finding Ember and Rowan in the living room. She lying on the floor with her feet up, he sitting on the couch with an open book. "Hi, Mommy." Rowan was helping me with math, but we're done now. Now he was reading a story to me, Ember announced, running to hug her. "How was work?" Rowan asked, and there was a genuine concern in his voice that made Anne feel seen and cared for. "Tough day. Very busy, short-staffed," she sighed, sitting in the armchair and taking off her shoes. "Dinner's almost ready," he said simply. "I made that pasta Ember likes, with a simple tomato sauce. Hope that's okay." Anne looked at him, surprised. He had taken the initiative to cook, without her asking, without making a big deal about it. He simply saw a need and met it. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time, she felt no discomfort in accepting the help. "Thank you so much." After dinner, while Anne was cleaning the kitchen, she could hear Rowan and Ember in the living room. First, he was helping her with the last few math exercises that had been left for after the meal. "So, if I have 5 apples and I eat 2, how many are left?" he would ask with infinite patience. 3, Ember would reply excitedly. "Very good. Now let's do a harder one." After the homework, Anne heard the sound of colored pencils being spread out on the table. They had moved on to drawing, an activity that had become a ritual between them. "I'm going to draw a unicorn," Ember announced. "Unicorns are hard." "I'll try to draw one too," Rowan replied, and Anne could hear the concentration in his voice. A few minutes later, Ember's crystal-clear laugh echoed through the house. "Rowan, that looks nothing like a unicorn. It looks more like a horse with an ice cream cone on its forehead." "You're right," Rowan laughed too. "Maybe I should try something easier. How about a tree?" More laughter. "Now it's worse. That tree looks like a giant lollipop." Anne discreetly peeked from the kitchen and saw Rowan feigning exaggerated frustration with his clearly intentionally bad drawings, making dramatic faces that sent Ember into fits of giggles. There was something deeply touching in seeing a grown man, clearly intelligent and capable, playing the fool just to hear a 5-year-old child laugh. It was obvious that he could draw. Anne had seen the sketches he made when he was helping Ember with school projects, but in that moment, he was feigning incompetence for the sole purpose of amusing the little girl, of seeing her happy. Anne felt something tighten in her chest. It had been so long since she had seen Ember laugh with such freedom, with such carefree joy. And it had been even longer since she herself had felt so safe, as if she could let her guard down, as if she didn't need to be constantly vigilant, as if she could just be. When it was time for Ember to go to bed, the three of them went up to the small bedroom together. Anne read the bedtime story, as she always did, but now with Rowan sitting in the chair next to the bed, listening with the same attention as Ember. After Anne finished reading and kissed her daughter's forehead, Ember turned to Rowan. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that showed how important his presence had become to her. Rowan smiled, not the polished smile he used with strangers, but the genuine, warm smile that Anne had learned to recognize as exclusively his. "Whenever you two want me to," he replied with a calmness that carried a promise. Anne felt something settle definitively in her chest. It was no longer fear or anxiety about what this constant presence meant. It was acceptance. It was gratitude. It was the understanding that sometimes the best things in life came not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple willingness to be present, day after day, offering constant care and silent love. Rowan wasn't trying to win them over or impress them. He was simply choosing to be there, to be a part of their lives, in the most natural and unpretentious way possible. And that, Anne realized, was more than enough. In fact, it was everything. It was a Thursday night when Rowan extended the invitation. Anne was finishing cleaning the kitchen after dinner, while he was helping Ember with a science project at the living room table. The sound of their voices, her asking enthusiastic questions, him answering with infinite patience, had become Anne's favorite soundtrack over the past few months. "Anne," Rowan called, as Ember went up to brush her teeth. "Would you like to take a walk with me tomorrow evening? Just the two of us." There was something different in his voice, a seriousness that wasn't usually there. Anne dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to look at him. His golden eyes held an intensity she hadn't seen before, as if he had made an important decision. "Of course," she replied, feeling something stir in her chest. "Mrs. Rodriguez can watch Ember. She always offers." "Great. There's a park near here that's beautiful in the late afternoon." The next evening, after Ember was safely with the neighbor, who adored the little girl and always jumped at the chance to spoil her with homemade cookies and old stories, Anne and Rowan walked through the neighborhood streets towards Bloomfield Square. It was a small green space that the community had lovingly cared for over the years, with wooden benches under old trees and well-tended flower beds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of the flowers that gave the place its name. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, but Anne could feel that Rowan was gathering the courage to say something important. "There are some things about me you should know," he said finally, as they sat on a bench under a crabapple tree in bloom. Anne turned to him, giving him her full attention. There was a vulnerability in his posture that she rarely saw, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the ground. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," she said gently. "I want to," he replied, looking at her. "I need to, if we're going to. If this is going to continue, you need to understand why I was so closed off before I met you both." Rowan took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. I was engaged once, he began, his voice low but steady. We dated for 3 years. We're engaged for 1. I thought we had built something solid, real. I was planning our life together, thinking about a house, kids, growing old beside her. Anne remained silent, but moved slightly closer, offering presence without pressure. My best friend was practically a brother to me, Marcus. We had known each other since college. He was my best man when I thought I was getting married. She, Isabella, always said he was like family to her too. The pain in Rowan's voice was palpable, even after all this time. Anne resisted the urge to touch him, sensing he needed to tell the story at his own pace. I worked a lot back then. I was building my company, stayed late at the office, traveled a lot. I thought I was doing it all for us, for our future. But in reality, I was neglecting the present. Rowan paused, looking at the blossoms falling from the tree around them like natural confetti. I came back from a business trip early, wanted to surprise her. I got home and... His voice broke for a moment. I found her with my best friend. In our bed, in the house we bought together, with her wedding dress hanging in the closet. Anne felt her heart ache, not from the pain of imagining Rowan hurt, but from the double betrayal he had faced, the person he loved and the person he trusted most, destroying his faith in love and friendship all at once. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For the worst part wasn't just the betrayal," Rowan continued, his voice firmer now. "It was finding out it had been going on for months. That all the times I came home and found Marcus there, all the explanations that seemed perfectly normal, all the smiles they gave me, it was all a lie. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world." He looked at Anne, and she saw years of distrust and self-protection in his eyes. "I closed my heart after that. I decided I would never let myself be that vulnerable, that stupid again. I dated, of course, but always kept my distance, never letting anyone get close enough to hurt me like that again." Anne remained silent, but there was a deep understanding in her eyes. She knew the pain of loss, though hers had come from death, not betrayal, but the fear of opening up again, the hesitation to become vulnerable, that she understood perfectly. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked gently. Rowan turned completely to face her, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made Anne's heart race. "Because with you two, it's different," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My heart is opening up again, and it scares me and excites me at the same time. For the first time in years, I want to let my guard down completely. I want to trust. I want to build something real." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. Anne felt tears well up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a complex emotion that mixed gratitude, relief, and something dangerously close to love. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand. It wasn't words. It wasn't an explicit declaration, but it was a clear signal. She wanted it too. She was also willing to try. She also felt that something special was growing between them. Rowan looked at their intertwined hands and smiled, the first genuine smile since he had started telling his story. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not running. For not judging me. For being here." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, holding hands, watching the sun complete its journey toward the horizon. They didn't need more words at that moment. Both knew that something had changed, that a door had opened, that they were walking together towards a future that neither of them had planned, but that both wanted to explore. The following week, it was Anne who took the initiative. It was a Saturday afternoon, and she was preparing a special dinner, nothing elaborate, but made with more care than usual. Homemade lasagna, a simple salad, and a chocolate cake she had attempted to make from a recipe she found online. "Ember," she called, while her daughter was playing in the living room. "How about you get the napkins ready for dinner tonight? Rowan is having dinner with us. Can I make flowers with them?" "Like Aunt Elena taught me." "Of course, my love." Anne watched Ember fold the napkins with serious concentration, creating little paper flowers that she carefully placed next to each plate. There was something deeply touching in seeing her daughter trying to make the table beautiful, preparing with care to welcome someone who had become important to them. When Rowan arrived, he found the table set with the special care that transforms a simple meal into something memorable. The cheap candles Anne had bought at the corner market cast a soft light. Ember's flower-shaped napkins added a touch of delicacy, and the smell of homemade lasagna filled the small apartment with the aroma of home. "It looks beautiful," he said, and Anne could see he truly meant it. "You two are incredible." The dinner was a quiet celebration of something that had not yet been named. Ember told them about her day at school, making the adults laugh with her precocious observations about her classmates. Anne shared funny stories about customers at the diner. Rowan talked about a book he was reading that he thought Ember would like when she was a little older. It was an ordinary, familiar conversation, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a growing intimacy, a sense of mutual belonging that made every word, every laugh, every exchanged glance more significant. After dinner, while Anne was giving Ember a bath and putting her to bed, Rowan cleaned up the kitchen. Not because she had asked, but because it was natural, because it's what you do when you're part of a family. When Anne came down after tucking Ember in, she found Rowan in the living room, looking around with a contemplative expression. He was observing Ember's drawings taped to the wall, the plants Anne cared for lovingly, the book stacked on the coffee table, the colorful blanket covering the old but comfortable sofa. "You know," he said, turning to her with a soft smile, "I thought I didn't want a family anymore. After what happened, I swore to myself that I would never let myself want that again." Anne moved closer, feeling her heart race. There was a seriousness in his voice that she recognized, the same one that was present on the night of their walk. "But with you two, my heart has opened up again," he continued, his golden eyes fixed on hers. "You've shown me that family isn't about perfection, or grand gestures, or having everything planned. It's about being present. It's about caring. It's about choosing, every day, to be part of each other's lives." Rowan took a step towards her, his hands finding hers naturally. "If you'll let me, we can try, no rush our way." It wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a dramatic declaration of eternal love. It was something deeper and more real. It was the acknowledgement that they had found something special together, and the mutual desire to nurture it, to see where it could lead them. Anne looked into his eyes and saw everything she needed to see. She saw a man who had been deeply hurt but was willing to take a risk again. She saw someone who genuinely loved her daughter, not as an obligation or a burden, but as a joy. She saw a person who respected her, who valued what she had built, who wanted to add to their lives, not control or change them. Instead of words, Anne simply held his hands more tightly. And in that simple gesture, in the way their fingers intertwined, in the smile that spread across both their faces, was the clearest and most complete yes that any word could express. They didn't need grand declarations or elaborate promises. What they had was better. It was real. It had grown organically. It was built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine affection, and the shared desire to create something beautiful together. As they embraced in the small living room, surrounded by the traces of a life that Anne had built alone, and that was now opening up to include more love, more laughter, more possibilities, both knew they were at the beginning of something special. It wouldn't always be easy. They had old wounds that were still healing, fears they would need to face, practical challenges they would have to navigate together. But they also had something that made it all possible. They had love, not the desperate, dramatic kind from the movies, but the steady, reliable kind that builds true families. And that, they knew, was more than enough. It was everything. 3 months after the night of the special dinner, life had settled into a rhythm Anne never knew was possible. It was no longer the constant rush of a single mother trying to handle everything alone. It was a shared daily life, where responsibilities and joys were naturally divided among 3 people who had chosen to be a family. Rowan arrived every Saturday morning with fresh bread from Mr. Henderson's bakery, always the sweet rolls that Ember loved, and the whole wheat bread that Anne preferred. It was a small ritual, but one that transformed weekends into something special. He would arrive with the smell of the bakery clinging to his clothes and a smile that said there was nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. "Warm bread!" Ember would shout, running to the door whenever she heard the key in the lock. Rowan had been given a copy of the apartment keys a month ago, after Anne realized it was absurd for him to wait outside when he arrived before them. They would have breakfast on the small balcony that Anne had turned into a cozy nook with plants and a small round table. Ember always insisted on sitting in the middle, creating what she called a family sandwich. Rowan would read the news from his phone aloud, always the funny or curious stories, never the sad ones, while Anne sipped her coffee and watched the two most important people in her life interact so naturally. Look at this," Rowan would say, pointing to a story about a dog that had learned to paint. "This dog is almost as much of an artist as you are, Ember." "Impossible," she would reply, indignant but laughing. "Dogs don't have fingers to hold a paintbrush, right?" Anne would laugh at these interactions, at the way Rowan always found ways to include Ember in conversations, making her feel important and heard. The weekdays had their own comforting routine. Rowan would arrive at 6 o'clock sharp, always with a small surprise. Sometimes it was a new book for Ember, other times special ingredients for dinner, always something that showed he was thinking of them during the day. He would help Ember with her homework at the kitchen table, while Anne prepared dinner, creating a domestic symphony of mingling voices, a math question, a patient answer, a sizzling pan on the stove, a child's laughter. "If I have 10 candies and I eat 3, how many are left?" Rowan would ask, following the exercise in the book. 7. "But can I eat 2 more?" Ember would reply, always trying to negotiate. "Finish your homework first, then we'll negotiate the candy," Anne would say from the kitchen, smiling at her daughter's attempt. After dinner, they had developed simple rituals that became the most precious moments of the day. On cold nights, Rowan would make his famous vegetable soup, a recipe he had learned from his grandmother, while Anne prepared hot chocolate and Ember arranged blankets on the couch to watch a children's movie. "A movie and blankets," Ember would announce, as if it were the most extraordinary discovery in the world, every time they finished dinner and realized it was getting cold outside. The preparation for these nights was almost as much fun as the main event. Ember would drag out all the blankets she could find, creating a sort of nest on the sofa. Rowan would adjust the TV volume and check if everyone could see well. Anne would bring the hot chocolate in special mugs, the unicorn one for Ember, the plain blue one for Rowan, and the one with flowers for herself. On warmer nights, they would sit on the small balcony, Ember on Anne's lap or leaning against Rowan, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood falling asleep, distant televisions, neighbors, conversations, the occasional bark of a dog. They didn't need much entertainment. Each other's company was enough. Rowan had become an expert at the games Ember invented. She would create elaborate games with rules that changed every round, and he would follow each new instruction with a comedic seriousness that made the girl roar with laughter. They built forts with pillows, organized fashion shows with her clothes, and created plays where he always played the exaggeratedly evil villain that she defeated with magic powers. "Now you're a dragon that only eats broccoli," Ember would command, and Rowan would embrace the role with total dedication, roaring dramatically and pretending broccoli was the most delicious thing in the world. "Roar! Where is my precious broccoli?" he would shout, crawling around the living room floor. "Never! I am the princess protector of broccoli," Ember would respond, brandishing an imaginary sword. Anne would watch these games from the kitchen or the balcony, her heart warmed by the way Rowan completely gave himself over to Ember's imagination. He wasn't just being polite or patient with a child, he was genuinely having fun, rediscovering a part of himself that had perhaps been forgotten during years of adult responsibilities. It was on a Thursday night, after a particularly delicious dinner and a play session that left all 3 of them a bit disheveled, that Ember appeared with a new drawing. She had been quiet for half an hour, concentrated at her small table in the living room, using all her colored pencils with meticulous care. "I'm done," she announced, running to show off her masterpiece. The drawing showed the 3 of them in front of the building where they lived. Anne and Rowan were holding hands, smiling, and Ember was in the middle, wearing the blue floral dress that had started the whole story. In the background, She had drawn the building with impressive detail for a 5-year-old. Windows with curtains, the brown door, even the plants on the balcony. And on the clothesline she had drawn next to the building, the floral dress swayed in the imaginary wind, as if it were dancing. But what made Rowan's and Anne's hearts stop for a moment was what was written at the top of the drawing. In green marker with careful but crooked letters, "We are beautiful together." Rowan looked at the drawing for a long moment, his eyes filling with an emotion he didn't try to hide. Without a word, he carefully folded the paper and placed it in his wallet, next to his ID. "This one will always stay with me," he said to Ember, his voice a little hoarse, "so that I never forget how beautiful we are together." "For real, forever and ever?" Ember asked, her eyes shining. "Forever and ever," he confirmed, hugging her. Anne, standing beside him, smiled with a serenity that came from a deep certainty. That moment, that drawing, that phrase written with childish innocence but emotional wisdom, captured everything she had ever wanted and had been afraid to dream of. It wasn't about having a lot of money or a big house or a glamorous life. It was about having people who genuinely cared for each other, who chose to be together every day, who found beauty in the simple moments. It was about being a real family. The weeks that followed brought a tranquility that Anne hadn't experienced since she was a child. Not the tranquility of an absence of problems. There were still bills to pay, challenges at work, small daily worries, but the tranquility of knowing she wasn't facing it all alone. There was someone there who shared the burdens and multiplied the joys. Rowan hadn't officially moved into the apartment, but his presence was in every corner. His toothbrush in the bathroom, his books mixed with Anne's on the coffee table, his favorite mug on the kitchen shelf. Ember had naturally reorganized her toys to include space for his things, as if there had never been a version of the family that didn't include him. It was on a Sunday night, after a lazy day of watching movies and eating popcorn, that the moment that would change everything forever happened. The three of them were on the couch, wrapped in blankets, watching a cartoon that Ember had chosen. Anne was on one side, Rowan on the other, and Ember had naturally migrated to lean against him, her head resting on his chest. During a quieter part of the movie, Ember turned to look at Rowan. There was an unusual seriousness in her honey-colored eyes, as if she were about to ask the most important question of her life. "Rowan," she said, her voice small but determined. "Yes, Princess. Can I call you Dad?" The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with emotion. Anne felt tears form in her eyes as she watched Rowan's face transform. Surprise, emotion, joy, gratitude, it all passed through his expression in a matter of seconds. Rowan looked at Anne over Ember's head, his eyes asking a silent question. Anne smiled and confirmed with a slight nod, her heart overflowing with a happiness she didn't know was possible. "If you want to," Rowan said, holding Ember in his arms as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. "I would love that." Ember smiled, the brightest smile Anne had ever seen on her daughter's face, and nestled into his embrace. "Dad," she tested the word in one as if trying out how it sounded. Daddy Rowan." "Just Dad is fine," he replied, kissing the top of her head. Anne watched them, feeling as if her heart would burst with so much happiness. That simple moment, on the worn-out couch of her small apartment, watching a cartoon on an ordinary Sunday night, was more perfect than any fantasy she had ever created about what it would be like to have a complete family. Later that night, after they put Ember to bed, with her insisting that both Anne and Rowan say goodnight as they always did, but now with a completely new meaning, Ember did one more thing that none of them expected. She brought out a shoebox she had decorated with colored paper and glittery stickers. Inside, she had carefully stored the blue floral dress, now too small for her, along with all the drawings she had made over the months, the entire evolution of their family depicted in colored pencil and marker. On the lid of the box, she had written in increasingly confident letters, "This is the day it all began. I want to keep it forever," she explained, as if it were obvious that precious memories should be preserved with care. So when I'm grown up, I can remember how you two met because of the dress." Anne and Rowan exchanged a look that communicated more than words ever could. Ember had understood, with the clarity that sometimes only children possess, that the dress hadn't just been a pretty piece of clothing. It had been the catalyst for something bigger, the first thread in a family tapestry that was still being woven. When Ember finally went to sleep, Anne and Rowan found themselves in the kitchen, making their nightly tea, another ritual they had developed, a way to decompress from the day and connect before bed. They moved around the small kitchen with the synchronization of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Him getting the cups while she heated the water, her adding honey while he chose the tea bags. "I can't believe she called me Dad," Rowan said, still with a note of amazement in his voice. "She's seen you that way for months," Anne replied, smiling. She was just waiting for permission to use the word. They laughed softly, the kind of shared laughter of people who know and appreciate each other's quirks. It was then that Ember appeared in the kitchen, barefoot and in her pajamas, clearly supposed to be asleep but having come down for one more glass of water or one more goodnight kiss. Instead, she hugged them from behind, her small arms trying to reach both of them at once. "Good night, Mommy." "Good night, Daddy," she said, and disappeared back towards her room, leaving Anne and Rowan standing in the kitchen, embraced by a 5-year-old and by a happiness that seemed too big to fit in the small apartment. In that moment, as they finished making their tea in comfortable silence, they both understood that they had arrived at something rare and precious. The new family was complete, not by accident or obligation, not by social pressure or practical convenience, but by choice. A daily choice renewed each morning to be there for one another. As that, they knew, made all the difference in the world. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.